The Legacy of Plantations, Exploitation, Columbus, and the Persistence of Systemic Racism. The history of plantations, whether for cash crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco, or for the chillingly systematic breeding of enslaved people, represents a cornerstone of global economic systems built on exploitation, dehumanization, and racial hierarchies. These systems, initiated in the Americas by figures like Christopher Columbus, were not aberrations, but deliberate structures designed to maximize profit through the commodification of human beings and land. The atrocities of Columbus's era, including the sale of indigenous girls as young as 9, set a precedent for centuries of racialized violence and systemic racism, a legacy that continues to shape societies today, often in increasingly brazen forms. Plantations, engines of wealth and suffering. Plantations were the economic engines of colonial empires, transforming stolen land and enslaved labor into vast wealth for European powers and their settler descendants. While cotton plantations in the U.S. South are often the focus of historical narratives, the plantation system was far broader, encompassing sugar in the Caribbean, tobacco in Virginia, rice in the Carolinas, and coffee in Latin America. These enterprises relied on the brutal enslavement of millions of Africans, whose labor fueled the transatlantic economy. However, a lesser discussed but reprehensibly horrific aspect of this system was the existence of breeding plantations, where enslaved people were forced to produce children to sustain and expand the slave labor force. Breeding plantations were not a marginal phenomenon, but a calculated response to economic realities. After the U.S. banned the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, the domestic slave population became the primary source of labor. Enslaved women were subjected to systemic rape and forced pregnancies, often by enslavers or designated stockmen chosen for their physical traits. Historian E. Franklin Fraser noted that some enslavers mated their human chattel as they did their stock, with no regard for familial or personal bonds. Accounts from formerly enslaved people like Maggie Stenhouse describe stockmen being tested and rented out to produce children, who were then sold as commodities. In some cases, hoods were placed over enslaved people's heads to conceal the identity of those involved, erasing any semblance of humanity from the act. These practices, concentrated in places like Virginia and Maryland, were driven by the cold logic of profit. A growing slave population meant more labor and higher market value. The plantation system was not merely economic, but ideological. It entrenched the notion of black and indigenous bodies as property, inherently inferior and exploitable. This racial hierarchy justified unimaginable cruelties, whippings, mutilations, and family separations, while normalizing the idea that certain groups existed to serve others. Plantations were, as scholar Grada Colomba writes, places where colonial wealth was amassed through the dehumanization and vilification of human beings so extreme that it produced race as a cognitive system of hierarchized categories. This ideology, born in the crucible of colonial greed, laid the foundation for systemic racism that persists today. Christopher Columbus, architect of exploitation. The plantation system's roots trace back to the late 15th century, when Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas inaugurated an era of conquest and commodification. Far from the heroic discoverer of schoolbook lore, Columbus was a ruthless opportunist whose actions set the template for centuries of racialized violence. Upon arriving in the Caribbean in 1492, he encountered the Taino people, whom he described as generous and compliant, noting, "They never refuse anything that is asked for." Yet he quickly saw their goodwill as a means to exploit them. His journals reveal a chilling pragmatism. He believed the Taino could be subjugated with minimal force, writing, "With 50 men they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them." Among Columbus's most egregious acts was his role in establishing a trade in sex slaves, including girls as young as 9. In a letter to a friend, he wrote, "100 Castellanos are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm. There are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand." While some apologists argue Columbus was merely describing, not endorsing this practice, the broader context is damning. His crews raided villages, abducted women and children, and distributed them as concubines or sold them for profit. Historian Andres Resendez notes that indigenous women were valued 50 to 60% higher than men due to their sexual and reproductive exploitation. Columbus's own shipmate, Miguel Cuneo, described taking a teenage girl as a gift from Columbus and brutally raping her when she resisted. Columbus's actions were not isolated but systemic. He imposed a tribute system requiring Taino people over 14 to deliver gold every 3 months, with non-compliance punished by mutilation or death. He enslaved thousands, sending many to Spain, where up to 40% died en route. His governance of Hispaniola, modern-day Haiti, and the Dominican Republic was so brutal that even Spanish contemporaries like Bartolomé de las Casas condemned it. De las Casas witnessed soldiers dismember, behead, or rape 3,000 natives in a single day, describing acts so foreign to human nature that he trembled while writing. By 1550, the Taino population, estimated at 250,000 to 300,000 in 1492, had dwindled to a few hundred due to enslavement, massacre, and disease. Columbus's legacy is not one of discovery but of destruction. He pioneered a model of colonization that treated indigenous peoples and their lands as resources to be plundered. His actions, selling young girls, enslaving entire communities, and extracting wealth through violence, set the stage for the plantation economies that followed, embedding racial hierarchies into the fabric of the Americas. Systemic racism today, a brazen resurgence. The racial hierarchies forged on plantations and in Columbus's wake have never fully dissipated. From a realist perspective, systemic racism persists because it is woven into the structures of power, economic, political, and cultural, that govern modern societies. While overt slavery ended, the logic of racial commodification and disposability endures, often adapting to new contexts. Today, systemic racism is not only persistent, but, in some quarters, increasingly brazen, fueled by political polarization, economic inequality, and the mainstreaming of white supremacist rhetoric. Economically, racial disparities remain stark. In the U.S., the median wealth of white families is nearly 10 times that of black families, a gap rooted in historical practices like redlining, discriminatory lending, and the exclusion of black workers from New Deal benefits. Mass incarceration disproportionately targets black and brown communities, with black Americans imprisoned at 5 times the rate of whites, often for similar offenses. The prison industrial complex, which profits from this disparity, echoes the plantation's logic of exploiting racialized bodies for economic gain. Politically, the resurgence of overt racism is unmistakable. The 2016 and 2020 U.S. elections saw a rise in white nationalist rhetoric, with figures openly defending Confederate monuments and Columbus statues as symbols of heritage. Voter suppression tactics, such as purging voter rolls and closing polling stations in minority neighborhoods, disproportionately affect Black and Latino communities, undermining democratic participation. In 2020, protests against police brutality, sparked by the killing of George Floyd, highlighted the persistence of racialized violence, with Indigenous and Black activists often leading calls to remove Columbus statues as symbols of genocide. Culturally, the romanticization of plantations as charming wedding venues or tourist attractions glosses over their gruesome history. Meanwhile, the word plantation remains a marketing tool in upscale developments, as seen in places like Hilton Head, South Carolina, where it evokes Southern nostalgia for white residents while erasing the trauma of enslaved people. Such erasure normalizes the plantation's legacy, reinforcing the idea that Black and Indigenous people working, enslaved, building the wealth people still hold today. The recent push to rename these communities, led by figures like 16-year-old Gullah descendant Isabella Miller, faces resistance, with some dismissing it as oversensitivity. This resistance reflects a broader refusal to confront the racialized violence embedded in these spaces. Globally, the plantation model reverberates in modern supply chains. Agricultural workers, often racialized migrants, face exploitative conditions in industries like palm oil, cocoa, and fruit production, echoing the coerced labor of the past. The environmental devastation caused by monoculture plantations, deforestation, soil erosion, and biodiversity loss also disproportionately harms Indigenous and marginalized communities, perpetuating the ecological carnage Columbus initiated. The uncomfortable truth about our past invites us to confront harsh realities that intertwine plantations, Columbus's atrocities, and systemic racism. These elements are not isolated historical events, but rather threads woven into the fabric of society, creating a tapestry of power dynamics that value profit and control over human dignity. The breeding plantation's cruelty and the exploitation of young girls under Columbus's reign are glaring examples of a worldview that dehumanizes vast populations for economic benefit. This historical perspective reveals a continued existence of these systems, transformed but not eliminated. Today, we witness the repercussions of this legacy in the wealth gaps that segregate communities, the carceral policies that disproportionately impact marginalized groups, and the cultural erasures that strive to silence Black, Indigenous, and other racialized voices. Systemic racism is not a relic of the past. It lives on, manifesting in various forms and hindering true progress towards equality. To forge a path forward, we must move beyond mere symbolic gestures. Renaming holidays or removing statues won't suffice. Real change calls for structural reforms such as reparations and land restitution, addressing the foundational inequalities rooted in history. In tandem with policy initiatives, there must be a cultural reckoning that dismantles the idealized narratives surrounding figures like Columbus, who symbolize the depths of exploitation and oppression. The escalating visibility of systemic racism today serves as a stark reminder that these issues are not receding, they are escalating, as theorists like Charles W. Mills note, the racial contract embedded in Western societies persists, perpetuating a framework that favors whiteness while continuing to marginalize others. Understanding that the crimes committed on plantations and throughout colonial history are not confined to textbooks but actively shape our current socio-political landscape is crucial. The legacy of these actions significantly influences who holds power, who experiences suffering, and who is often erased from the collective memory. Acknowledging this uncomfortable truth is vital in shattering the chains of an oppressive past. Facing this reality boldly opens the doorway to meaningful dialogue and necessary action. Only through an unwavering commitment to confronting the systemic racism that continues to thrive can we pave the way toward a future that values human dignity and equity for all. We must ensure that history serves as a catalyst for change rather than a shadow that looms over progress. By Scott Young, aka Sin Famous Gamer.